We are the reps from the governance group, and yeah, good, huh? Thank you. So we were asked to take a look at the governance model and to answer three questions about it. What ways do we think the new governance model and process will support implementation of the interoperability roadmap? And do we see any unexpected consequences or challenges? In what ways can state and local government entities effectively engage with the governance process to advance the changes? And finally, is there information from other departments, agencies, or organizations that could be shared with Health and Human Services that, if it could be shared with Health and Human Services, would meaningfully benefit the interoperability roadmap? So I guess I'll take the first piece since I have the first notes. Okay, so Barry will do challenges. I'm Mitch with Napa.
Barry Zimmerman, Ventura.
We had two county folks, lots of state folks at the table, and not surprisingly, sort of different perspectives on what this might bring and how we might be able to use it in our own agencies. And one of the conversations that went on at the table both after Gretchen's presentation yesterday and the table today were Barry and I talking about how we bring this model down to a local level and what it would mean to really operationalize it, I hate to use the word, at an agency level. How would a small and a medium-sized county make use of that? And that's, in all honesty, something I really struggled with up until today when I saw the light. And hallelujah, yeah. Hallelujah. There we go. Thank you. All right. So one of the key pieces that we identified today, one of the key things that the governance model can bring to the implementation, to the forwarding of interoperability, is clear leadership. In that separating strategy from tactics. If you all remember the charts that Gretchen shared with us, there was the strategy sort of spectrum and then a tactics spectrum, and that by clearly separating those two things, it gave structure to the process, a replicable structure, and provided equal import to those two pieces. Let you set a strategy, let the tactics support the strategy, and not lose, as I'm wont to do in a project, sight of the strategy because it's easy to affect the tactics rather than looking at the big picture. You want to talk about the sort of the associated challenge with that?
Yeah. With every good plan, there's a challenge. And with the leadership part of it, we said the challenge is actually finding the right leaders to be the champions to carry on this strategy. And I think oftentimes we can find individuals that help with the tactical side very well, but cultivating champions of leaders that then can transform organizations, the initiative, to support it, and to give that necessary empowerment is a big task. And I think that's an area that, at least at the local level, and I think at all levels, you have to take concentrated time and effort to find and cultivate the leaders to be your champions. And without that, it makes it hard to empower the rest to move forward.
So another benefit or positive to the whole governance structure was the concept on building on lessons learned from successful efforts or successful state and county partnerships that, as Gretchen described it, as we discussed at the table, creating a repository of examples of how interoperability has worked, providing shining guiding principles to move forward to, so that when I'm struggling at a local level, how do I do this? How do I get people engaged around it? How do I take those first steps? There's a place to go to and actually find things that had been done, people who would overcome the obstacles, and good examples of why people should engage around the process. And finally, another positive to the whole governance structure is that it provides a common understanding of what's expected. By setting the governance structure, by setting the strategy, by setting the tactical approach to things, and by having this standardized approach to the process, people across the spectrum of implementation can clearly understand what's expected of them and how things ought to be moving through the process.
Just two other items that we identified as challenges in a structure and a governance model is funding. Funding's often in a siloed effect, and so that's difficult to build that collaboration across multiple entities in that regard, or there's no funding at all. So there's a lot of where we can come together and set a strategy, but implementing that strategy might fall short without the funding. And I think one of the most other challenges and uniquenesses is trying to maintain the governance model to allow the influence of a client-centric approach to occur. Meaning getting the input from a client perspective, or who the ultimate services are to benefit, and how to bring that up into the governance model to establish policy, to establish the strategic direction, and the implementation is a challenge in order to keep that up front most in the mind of the governance structure. So those were our challenges there. And then our last question we had, is there information or other departments, agencies, or organizations that if it could be shared with Health and Human Services would meaningfully benefit the interoperability roadmap? That's a lot there. We kind of broke it down to just some ideas that would help coalesce the roadmap and our journey on that. And some of it is kind of some suggestions of how we should behave in this journey on the roadmap. One of it is to be proactive in sharing information. In essence, as the ability to gather and consolidate information across systems, not just have it sit idle and not benefit others who can benefit from that information, but be proactive in saying that there's information that can benefit you caseworker over here, as well as you caseworker over here, and have them reap the benefits of having this come together. The other benefit is for technical assistance and training. And this was more in particular for entities. In particular, we were talking how the state can influence and help local governments in establishing it. Well, not every local entity has the resources to experiment and go through and establish these models or to learn by trial and error, and so technical assistance from a larger entity would be very valuable there. As well as providers are key in inputting a little bit similar to client-centric, but providers who actually deliver the services, in particular the child welfare system, are key in giving feedback back up in order to help shape what is the possibilities and what are the meaningful interoperability activities and structures that need to be in place is an important part. So those are some of the areas that we discussed in the governance model and went through.
Thank you. Let's open up first of all, any other commentary from the group for clarification? Good job. Okay. So what about, are there any questions for clarification? Is everybody clear about what a recommendation is? I mean, what would happen next? Are there specific things that you see are relevant to happen in the next 6 months, next 2 years?
You're not supposed to throw extra questions at us as fast. Was that a question for us?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, that was a question. You could throw it to your lifeline over there as well.
I guess going off of the theme of providing support, providing framework, to have the governance model be something, I don't know if adopted, firmed up, pushed out, what the right verb is there, but to have it be formalized and be put out as a model that is accepted, available, would I think be a very good first step.
Questions? Governance. This is going to rule your life for the next 20 years. So now is a good time to ask a question on governance. No pressure. I have one other question for you before we move on, which was there was some conversation yesterday about what's the on-ramp, or what's the path for other feedback into the governance model, either providers, citizens, counties, cities. Would that come up in your conversation at all about how those stakeholders get to play?
How would we get the feedback from?
How do stakeholders, interact with the model?
I don't think we necessarily talked about the mechanism by which that would happen. I think really in the education of a governance model is that we need to change our culture of how we deliver services, and oftentimes it's delivered in a very paternalistic approach. This is what I'm going to do for you, as opposed to changing that attitude is, here, I'm here to serve you, so I need your input, so that can then saturate back up through the system on this is the real needs. And so we have not reshaped our industry per se to ask those type questions for various reasons. There's a lot of times there's some legal limitations and so forth, as well as risk of legal liability when we start reaching outside of the parameters, this is what I can do and not do. So I think it's really a cultural change that needs to occur in order to allow that facilitation of information to come back, and whether there's one mechanical way to do that, feedback, stakeholder groups or whatever, may be in the mix there. But that would be my look at it.
I wonder if Gretchen has got
She's a solution to that.
I just really don't have all the answers, but I can talk a little bit about some of the discussion that we had around that. So yesterday there were questions around how do others get involved, because the perception that I got from the questions in the afternoon, they all seem to be focused more so on the process level, and I think because we were mindful of keeping the information that we shared at a higher level, there were some assumptions made based on because we didn't go down into the detail, if you will, of the process. So one of the things was it appeared that each one of those subcommittees was working in a siloed fashion. They weren't communicating with each other before it came back up to review, recommendation, and approval at the strategy level. And that definitely is not the intent. The intent is that the leadership within each subcommittee will be communicating across each of the subcommittees. Also, we talked about the input into those subcommittees, and as I mentioned yesterday, it wasn't meant to be a final list of groups or entities, organizations that are doing work in those specific areas. I'm very interested in what is happening at the local level that we could also incorporate into the information that those subcommittees are looking at. So for example, the Enterprise Architecture Subcommittee, we have listed what's happening at the agency level and the state level, but what's happening at the county level? Are there work groups that are active today that we're unaware of? That's the beauty of this forum, is that we're all coming together to talk about what we're doing, so we're no longer having siloed conversations like our siloed system. So I'm very open and receptive to the conversations around that. I think that's one way that we can all be involved in it. Another way is through the requests. I mean, exactly what we had demonstrated through the proof of concept is it wasn't a state entity that was coming in that was asking for the ability to share data. So that's another way that local can be involved in the governance process. And as I mentioned yesterday, this is something that we've developed the general framework. Currently, I would say that we are working at the strategic level because we don't have it formalized yet. but we still have a need. There's things that needed to go through this process, but because it's not formalized today, we're finding incremental ways that we can make progress. So as we continue to develop it, and I think tactical level is definitely a place that we can all be involved in. I welcome the suggestions, the calls, send me a note, give me your ideas. If it's not something that you feel comfortable talking about here, I'm very receptive to how we can work collaboratively to get to where we're trying to be. So I think those are a few ways that it wouldn't be just a state organization, but other ways that folks can feed into it and be involved. Hopefully that answered it.
Great, thank you.
So I'm Angie DeVos with San Diego County, HHSA.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Schwartz with the Office of Health Information Integrity. Our question was, based on the presentation and discussions during the symposium, are there considerations that should be addressed by the legal confidentiality driver that would support or accelerate implementation of the interoperability roadmap? Also, are there specific laws, regulations, or policies that present legal and confidentiality barriers that could be identified early in the process for review?
We actually talked about a lot of stories in our group, but I think one we really hit on was data use agreements. So how many people in this room have had to deal with a data use agreement or data exchange in some manner? Okay. So we have the solution to all that.
So our group was considering the governance model that we heard a presentation on multiple times, and we were considering how to make that more effective and efficient so that only the things that need to go to the governance committee or council would go to that. Instead, there are many things that could be immediately hit the low-hanging fruit that could be addressed by this Office of Interoperability.
So those of you on the side might not be able to see the board right here. So I think we've called it the HHS Office of Interoperability, Legal Compliance, and Confidentiality. And then we've tasked them with various activities to start with. I'm sure that their office will grow over time. So one of those ideas was to change the culture within our various legal departments. Right now, I feel like a lot of our departments and our group felt like a lot of our legal departments kind of fall back on just saying no to various sorts of data exchanges and data use because maybe there's a little bit of fear, concern, things like that. So we talked about how our new office would educate, train, and do some public outreach. And then related to that, they would also include a lot of stakeholder feedback when they're considering all the various legal confidentiality and regulation that they're dealing with.
The office could also make recommendations to HHS or to another decision maker who could consider those recommendations for legislation change as necessary. We can share many things without having to change the law, but there are times when we run into that barrier and we simply need to make a legislative change. The office could also strive for consensus and consistent interpretation of confidentiality laws by first creating a wizard or a program application that would search all the laws to determine what laws affect confidentiality and protection of information, to establish where's the baseline, what are we dealing with, what are we looking at. Then they would also come out with a state policy which would define the state's interpretation of those laws and how they need to be applied throughout the entire state and on all of our actors. This would be extremely helpful for our county partners, as well as to determine a state decision for how certain state laws in particular need to be interpreted and applied.
And then related to that, just like the state would come out with some clear ideas, the state would also be our liaison to deal with federal statutes like HIPAA and things like that, so we could also in turn get clear directives from the Fed as to federal laws. And then lastly, again, all kind of tied together here, just creating a big compilation of all the various federal, state laws that we could basically review and hopefully identify maybe some discrepancies or some areas where the state laws are tighter than the federal laws and revisit those and see whether there's some movement or some room there. And that was it. We were very concise with our one solution.
Let's open it to a couple of questions if there are. Come on, it's not, there you go. Shell.
This is an interesting idea. So I'm interested if the group talked about any real or perceived barriers to that. And I hear funding, but and to that, go ahead.
Well, I mean, we did talk about funding, and one of the ways that you could fund something like this is within the agency. There are departments that can contribute, because they're going to get the
Sort of a cost allocation model. Okay, so the reason I'm asking is because I'm under the impression that Cal Ojai actually has a database of regulation and legislation that has actually been put together, and that this is, yes? For health.
not the human services.
Okay, so we could add to it. I mean, the basic vehicle's there. So my thought here is reach for something beyond your grasp and implement that. There's nothing stopping you.
So that's exactly what we were talking about. We could plug this into existing office or like Ojai, for example, or an existing agency department. And it would be something that we could actually do. Ojai does a lot of this work already in terms of HIPAA and CMIA. And so we simply need to add a little bit more on top. But this is doable.
Yay!
Any other comments or concerns or questions?
Laura. Use your outdoor voice.
We just came back from Washington, D.C., where we did a report about this grant project, and while we were at ACF, they mentioned that within the next 30 to 60 days, they're going to be releasing a confidentiality toolkit, which will be available around the country. So that may be another tool that this team could use.
And we did talk about that.
Don't hold your breath.
It's imminent, I'm sure.
Sorry.
That toolkit has been imminent for about 3 years.
Only two, Larry. Only two, but it's growing. It's getting mature. Like a nice wine out here.
But the toolkit goes along with the education, training, and public outreach that needs to happen.
Well, just one question though, as Michelle is like, let's go do it. But who's the let's? How would you actually see that sort of happening? Can you imagine or did you discuss how that could actually move forward? And without somebody sort of establishing an office of legal sharing and interoperability, which could never happen or it could happen, probably not ever, but who knows? But assuming that you're not waiting for a sort of an act of Congress or an act of the legislature to create another agency, what would be a step that would actually help move that forward that you guys could take without to advance that in 6 months, a year?
If we're talking about having it be part of HHS, then we would simply need leadership to say, one of these different departments or offices, plug in, this is it. And then we do it. We all have a chain of command. We all have our marching orders. We follow those marching orders, especially when it's such a great purpose.
So I'll just ask one further question following on Michelle's lead here, which is what would inhibit you guys and the team here to actually take a step forward? I mean, is that something, being outside of the agency and being outside of the state actually, to actually take that kind of step to move that kind of idea forward, is there a mechanism or do you see a way to be able to do that?
I just think it comes back to buy-in. Honestly, yes, and that too.
Michelle's
But-
staring at you, Jerry.
It's like Jennifer said. I mean, everybody gets their marching orders, and if leadership decides that this is important enough, then they will move on it.
All right, I see a hand up there. There you go.
Yeah, we already took the first step by hiring Jennifer Schwartz.
So Anthony, that goes in the 6-month period. Jennifer Schwartz, 6-month. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think the direction is how do we go without waiting for authorization in some way. to-
you have it.
Right,
I think you have it.
That's the two-week box, not the
Yeah.
6-month box.
yeah, right.
So how is this going into governance?
Well, that's what, that was
So,
going to mention.
sure.
that as well.
The idea of having an office of interoperability is more than just the legal piece. That was kind of like a branch under it. The idea is to, you need, to keep this momentum going, someone has to be, own it. There has to be a place where all of these things we're talking about, not, at least gets coordinated, it gets, the leadership is there. Not that they would do it all, but someone's there who says, okay, well, we're not going to let this, fall by the wayside. We said we would do this, let's see what we do. So I think it's bigger than just the legal part. That's what we were sort of tasked with. But I think we were thinking that, I think New York talked about having something like that in what they've done. So the governance fits in here, and to the extent that you need to coordinate some technology pieces, that would, maybe you work with your office on some of that. And so I just see that it's a leadership and a coordinating body that is housed in the agency, at least, as it relates to the departments and the counties that work with the various departments and need this to occur.
I think you may have started to answer the question I had, which was keying on this middle part of consensus and consistent interpretation of confidentiality laws, part of which is state-mandated interpretation of these laws. Does the fact that this office exists within agency give you that automatically? Or do they supersede departmental legal, interpretations, et cetera?
So I think that's an excellent question. In no way would we be telling judges how to interpret the law. So I want to
Judges, I'm talking about the department.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there needs to be, for certain pieces that we can certainly identify that for, there needs to be a consistent, uniform approach. And that needs to be a state policy. So when we have many gray areas, and everybody at that table had a different interpretation for certain laws and how they are applied. But there are times when we can have a uniform interpretation that the state can say, this is our policy as the way the state interprets it. The feds have done that many times. There are many policy guidelines. Certainly, there are a ton for HIPAA. There's no reason why we can't do the same. That would be of assistance to all of our state agencies, all of our state departments. It would also be of enormous assistance to our counties and our local government. So they can say, now we no longer have to do this interpretation for every department inside of our local community 58 times for every county. We have one consistent interpretation that we can rely on.
Question. There's a lot of work entailed in setting up the governance system, the community, standing up all of the different committees and subcommittees, et cetera, putting in place the processes. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done now, as opposed to waiting until the whole governance model is in place. Some legal data agreements need to be looked into, progress made, communications plans made, et cetera. Now, so far as I understand, this group dissolves now. So are there any plans for this group to be the agents of change to move forward to the next stage within the next 6 months?
I'm not sure that we can answer that question. I do know that there are pieces of this that OHI is actually doing in terms of a model NPP, that's Notice of Privacy Practices, model policies for how to create and update your NPPs, model modular participation agreements for data exchange, especially with regard to the exchange of health information. So there are pieces, there are also tools that OHI puts out. That being said, those are limited to health. So the question is greater in that who's going to take all of it? And I can't particularly myself answer that question. That's not helpful, but...
Let me come back to this for just a second. You heard Diana earlier at lunch talk about this isn't going to be one unit that's going to take over and do the whole job for everybody else.
this is one unit that's going to help coordinate and, help lead, and the leadership is really important. The governance model is essentially already in place at the state in terms of going up and resolving any conflicts or difficulties or getting agreement. After the first conference, I was so pumped up about what we were doing. We set up 5 different committees involving county people and models that were working elsewhere, and we were gung-ho, except we were getting a little ahead of this symposium. So we backed off. But I intend to renew that as soon as this is over. So this may not continue as a formal group, but as Belinda said, Jennifer, as talented and hardworking as she is, isn't going to do this all by herself. We have several hundred attorneys in HHS in different departments, and we have previously set up committees and worked together. We have 58 county councils, and they have more than one attorney in each office. They're interested in this. So it's a matter of finding things that work, sharing them, and working through these. And frankly, the secretary, myself, Jennifer, Larry Bolton, we're all really committed to doing this. So I think we are going to go forward.
I still have to say something. You can't clap until I'm done. So I had this is not so much a question for you as much as it is an observation of how what you're talking about fits into some conversations that I've had here. I'm Richard McWilliams from San Diego. I'm the IT director for Health and Human Services Agency in San Diego, but my background is more in knowledge management and how that fits into how IT is used in that. And one of the things what this whole conversation we just had, and really what this entire symposium about, is knowledge management. And the thing that I noticed and that has been brought up in different ways in the last 2 days since I've been here is the fact that this isn't, everyone here is interested in doing it, but it's nobody's job. And if we've transitioned, is there anybody here who has not heard the term the information age? Right? Do you know that we're not in it anymore? The reality is we've transitioned to what's now referred to as the knowledge age. We've identified that information is out there, but what determines success in the future is what you do with it and how that knowledge is used in an actionable way. And that's what we're all here trying to do. But once we all leave here and we all go back to where we came from, there is nobody there that it's their job to do that. If you look at Fortune 500 companies, if you look in the federal government, there are, whether you call them a chief knowledge architect or whatever the title is that they use, there's a role within these agencies that their function is to do this, to ensure that we're sharing information across the agencies and between different agencies. And I think that's something that this effort highlights that we need to be doing. And this is something that as we move forward, we're going to continue to run into, that we go back and the number of people here is very small compared to the number of people we're supposed to be championing this cause with. So it's something I think that we need to look at in terms of this just being one aspect of the larger piece of sharing knowledge among all of these different agencies, and whether or not it's important enough to actually call it someone's job, stand up in office to have that happen, and provide the funding for it to happen. Otherwise, it's not really a priority.
Glenn, you want to say one thing?
Just real quick. Just to provide some level of equal time for the very large legal confidentiality group. Both groups are very consistent in their targeting the needs and what they would like to see happen. Much of it, certainly our group got a little bit more into data needs and encrypted. That we love encrypted data. We love data user audit capabilities. We love client IDs. We love all that stuff. But the real message is similar to the message that you've heard, is directly around leadership. We want authority, we want direction, we want some consistency in discussion around the interpretation of law and how that translates to the clients and the programs that we serve. And it's a combination of folks working together, particularly led by the program needs and the client's needs. So it's that conversation and that leadership, this is going to be a familiar theme you're going to hear across the board, that was really the driver on that. So nice job. We're right there with you. Yeah.
Thank you. If you could just bring your stickies to Anthony for further clarity. How about a round of applause?
We are the IT group, and like any good IT group, we came up with this in two separate things. We were siloed, and then at the last second integrated. So hopefully in the future we'll be more interoperable. So my name's John Russell. I'm from the California Health and Human Services Agency, and we had the IT. So I'm going to paraphrase the questions because Richard's fallen asleep. What considerations should be addressed by the information technology effort to support and/or accelerate the adoption of the interoperability roadmap? That was the first one. And our answers are going to roll into both of these, so just keep both questions in mind as we speak. The second one was describe any relevant lessons that should be considered, included in the state's interoperability roadmap. So since I have the mic, I guess I'll go first. Oops, I'll drop my thing. So a lot of our discussion over there was around governance, obviously, but we took it down at a little different level. We took it more to a data governance, and this is more of an operational governance. So implement effective data governance that addresses data quality and ownership. And what we mean by this is, somebody said it earlier, free the data. So once you free the data, it's out there for whoever has an agreement to use that. But how they use it has to be governed and effectively. So to do that, we have to establish owners and establish individual operational governance bodies to be able to monitor and address those issues that come up as needed. So I'm going to pass it on to my good buddy.
Could you just paraphrase that? The action is?
The action is implement effective data governance. And then that addresses data quality and ownership. That's for everybody out there. So now Richard.
Thanks. Hi, again, I'm Richard from San Diego. And the group that the way we looked at it, we kind of came up with about 20 different items and then eventually merged them into different categories. And as we were looking at this from the IT's perspective and building the system that's supposed to do all of this, it was a little bit like dumping out a box of Legos and then figuring out, how are we going to put this all together? So one of the first things, and the first action that I think needs to be done from the consensus, is that we have to define the as-is. We have to look at all the Legos and figure out what they are and how do they work before we can figure out how to work them, how to put them together. And it has to be defined all the way down to the every system in every participating organization. So right now we have a pretty good idea of what's out there, but before we can build an interoperable system, we have to know definitively every system that is out there that we're trying to make talk to the other, and map it out, and then determine which of those are already interoperable, which ones are not, and then identify from that how we're going to fit all those Lego pieces together into something that actually does something. So the action was define an as-is before we continue.
And that's on the county level or the state level or both?
That is down to the local level. What is every county agency using, and then roll that all the way up to where we have one map that shows what every entity that's going to participate in this is using for all these different methods of managing data.
Okay, so I'm Barbara Needell from the University of California at Berkeley. So guess what I'm going to talk about? This is that we remember to keep in mind that we find ways to continue to provide access to all of this data once we have it, and we can link it across systems to support research and evaluation, while at the same time to qualified researchers, making sure that they can adequately protect confidentiality and privacy. That particularly with the foster care use case in the child welfare side, we have so much talk about evidence-based practice and so little evidence. There's so much more research to do to even understand what works. And there's all of this data available across systems, data that was not designed for research purposes, but that can be used to do research and provide evaluation of programs at the same time as we move forward. In some ways, this is an easier sell. The data still has to be shared at the individual level and linked at the individual level in order for it to be useful. But then the results are aggregate, either posted publicly in the aggregate or used for research when the findings are aggregate findings where individuals are protected. And there's much less resistance to that kind of use of the data than it is to the harder fight to get people to share individual data across systems and all of those privacy considerations. And in a way, it's a win on the way to complete data sharing across systems for the integrated personal use of records across systems. No surprise it would come from me as an academic researcher, but we do think that this is a useful and important way that the data can be used.
So the action is carry on more?
To make the data, well, it's not easy to make the data accessible to qualified researchers who can pass the confidentiality, who can prove that they can have a good, we have IRBs, you have the Committee for the Protection of Human Subjects at the state that any project should have to go by, but to continue to provide access to qualified researchers as data are linked.
The access to data analytics is what we're talking about?
The access to research, let researchers have access to the data as we move forward.
Okay, so creating a link between the academic and the data, to be able to do that more. That's calling that out specifically.
When we talked about it, it wasn't so much as building that into our systems, but just making the data available. And as Barbara was going on, it's more of a governance issue of how do you vet researchers to have access to that data. So it's just creating that avenue to provide data to researchers. So it's more of a governance, it's funny, almost all the IT issues were governance. But anyway, it's more along that line.
Yeah, it comes back to me because I'm the only spokesperson for my table there.
He's the only brave one.
So, thank you. So the next thing that the group came up with was that in order to go ahead and continue forward, we have to identify the constraints that we are to operate within, and then develop a plan to operate within them. And some of those are obviously governance, which has been discussed. Also, it's been brought up as there are going to be funding constraints, time, labor, how labor interacts, how that involves unions and how unions are going to deal with these types of things. And part of that, probably the biggest part, is policy, because there's a lot of things that need to be decided before we can continue basically from the governor, from local governments, that all of those have to be in a line so that we can create an IT system that everyone, all of the leaders at every level is going to accept. If we don't have all of that, we're going to end up just running into a series of roadblocks and not being able to move forward. So the action was identify constraints and develop a plan within those constraints that's actionable.
So that's a plan for?
A plan for an IT solution that is within those constraints. So, for example, one thing that came up and was talked about here was the New York model. They, in terms of identifying who a person is, there is no database. There is a way that they search. Through recognizing certain characteristics that are defined, a person is identified as the same person in all of these different systems, because if all of these things match, that must be the same person. Another way to go is a centralized index where there is a unique identifier assigned to a person, and then that's one case. There's other situations in which they're local, as has been discussed, the interpretation of law with regard to what can be shared and what's not going to be shared is one thing. Is it going to be directed down by the state? Is it going to be discussed? So before we can develop a system that is going to do the things we want it to do, we need to determine what are those things. And those are policy, those are business decisions. We can't really set out on this, embark on this process of building a system and then later on find out that all the great ideas we had that were built into architecture are outside of, they're off limits and they're not going to be implemented.
And the only other thing I would say is not a system, but a framework.
Yeah, the framework, because we know certain ones
But
are.
I'm sorry, is that different than NISIA, MIDA, and NEEM in terms of setting it and the 9 areas that Lynette articulated? I'm just trying to flesh out if there's something specific that's different than what we.
The constraints are obviously those. The things that we took for given were things that we talked about. It has to be secure, right? That thing is generally accepted. There has to be accountability for it. It has to follow HIPAA. It has to follow the frameworks that we talked about. Those all have to be there. But those things are only to deal with the technology piece of it. What we don't have is an agreement and a box within WeWork in terms of if you told us, everyone here, anyone involved in IT, go and build it, I guarantee you it would be more than you could afford. So the question is, in terms of this system that we come up with, do we assume that we can go out and direct counties to say, if you're going to participate, then you have to adopt this tool, and because that's the only tool we're going to integrate? Or do we define that is the 80% rule is what we go by? Or is it that each local government gets to decide whether they're going to share this information, but only if the state pays for it? Is the state going to pay for it? So the things that have to be decided before we can actually develop a plan have to be put before us, so that basically we can think outside the box, but we don't even know what the box is at this point. And until we know that, we're not going to be able to develop a solution. We have a framework, but you can't define a specific solution without knowing some of those things that are unique to California, that are unique to how we want to approach this from a policy level. The basic one, the easiest one, is identification. Right now, we don't know. I don't know if the way forward that we are going to proceed is universally accepted, and it's been directed that we will not have a person identifier. There will never be a number associated with every person that we reference in this system.
So one of the first things that was brought up within the IT committee when we talk about interoperability has been the term enterprise architecture. And that's an easy one. That's something that I think everyone in the state would say is something that is absolutely necessary when you talk about putting siloed systems together and incorporating more of a single approach to how we address IT in the state. The problem is that it's easy from a technology perspective to talk about that, and I could sit here all day, and I'm sure there's other architects that could easily talk about the whys and the hows that you would do that. The question is that once you've established that, and I think we have, what's next? And the next thing that I think is really important when we talk about enterprise architecture is how to implement sustainable EA practices, so that not only are we implementing, but we're keeping it going, and we're successful moving along in the future. So again, easy to talk about it, implementing, but let's talk about keeping it going. And some of those sustainable EA practices that we came up with include training, knowledge transfer, IT classifications, and skill sets. And I think it's important that, especially with a lot of these state systems and vendors that are coming in to develop these systems for us, they're going away. We're transitioning into maintenance and operations, and we need these principles in place to make sure that our systems are continuing to be successful and, more importantly, sustainable without the need to continue with these vendor contracts. So our action for this is to implement sustainable EA practices to make interoperability successful. Next.
Right.
Oh, I'm sorry. We guys got one.
We had this rehearsed earlier.
It's me again. And this is one that's been mentioned, so this is not going to come as news to anybody.
So just for purposes of time, I just want to make sure if it's not new, and we've heard it before, I want to push towards new.
Well, this is not new to the group as far as it's been discussed in terms of the overall, the interoperability, this entire group. But in terms of the IT solution, we need to have a common vision, strategy, and operational plan developed specifically for how we are going to develop this solution. Then when we all go back to our different counties and so on, we're working within that same the same plan. So that should have been probably one of the first things that we mentioned.
Yeah.
But that was one of the ones that we came up with out of the group, that we all have to be working off the same IT plan.
So that's the only one between the two that actually we did come up with as well, is a shared vision between business and IT, so we all have the same direction moving forward and we know where we're going at least the highest level. So, and I mean, we all can say that here, but again, we take that out for education and talk to a whole bunch of different people from the rest of our departments, our counties, our local. We have to have that.
All right. Ben just said he forgot to introduce himself, so I'll introduce you for him. This is Ben Hayford. He's our enterprise architect over for the Child Welfare New System Project. So, yeah. I'm Sarah Dion from the Child Welfare New System Project. The card that I got was more of a lessons learned. So we understand that data exchange means that you have a sender and a receiver, and that you both have to do things right in order to make that happen. And sometimes things do not go right. For example, we had an example that we did a really good job calculating provider payments, and we're going to send out the checks for provider payments, and guess what? Some of those checks came back because the address wasn't complete. We're like, oh crap, okay. That was not a good thing to happen. So what it turned out, it was between the two, the sender and the receiver, the sender had an address field that was 40 characters long. The receiver had an address field that was 30 characters long. Yeah, not good. So the apartment number got cut off on some of the addresses, so the envelopes come back to us and we have a problem. So obviously there's shared responsibility between this, and we had a big conversation in our table about shared responsibility, and it turns out a lot of our systems are maintained by vendors. And when you have shared responsibility and things go wrong, we all figured out we get a lot of shared finger pointing really fast. So we want to get over that. So one of our lessons learned was then to develop contracts that include remedies or incentives to address issues or problems when there is shared responsibility between these interoperable systems. So.
Good afternoon. Mary Shamuel with Santa Clara County. One of the themes I've been hearing is about funding. So we too address that funding issue, because when we talk about interoperability, when we're building systems, we want to make sure that the feds and the federal agencies will support us and include funding so that we can make our systems interoperable. So the things that we came up with, actionable item, is work with federal agencies to identify and implement acceptable cost allocation model to support funding for interoperability that encourages innovations at the practitioner level.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, did the conversation of A87 come up?
Yes.
So that's a mechanism that's today.
I couldn't remember the number of it.
A87, yeah. It's 2 years and 3 months until it disappears. So probably maybe the only time the OMB is going to provide that waiver without somebody demonstrating the usefulness of it.
Exactly.
It's at the state level, but the question is how that would, I'm I'm not sure if you were speaking from a state level or a county level.
But both, all
You can
levels.
flow down?
Yeah, all levels, especially even at the county levels when we write APD. So we want to make sure that interoperability is included in those systems that we want to build. The justifications and the acceptance goes to the state and then from the state to the federal. So we want to make sure that that lexicon will become standard language in every cost allocations that we seek.
So the recommendation I would make sure that we have up there and you consider is A87 because it's not a theoretical waiver. It's real today, and it's going to go away pretty soon if people don't take advantage of it.
Yes. Yeah.
It's going to go away.
Yeah. We don't want it to go away.
Right. But there's 12/31/15. It goes away.
Yeah.
Without recognizing some action by the state to take advantage of it. And OMB has said, show me what you've done with it. And otherwise, we're not going to extend it. That came from the top of the CMS just 2 weeks ago. They said, OMB is not going to even address it. So it's right here, right now. It's a very real thing.
Hi, Sherry Heller from the County of Sacramento Health and Human Services Department. Daniel suggested that we take a few minutes before we launch into our 3 solutions to talk about how the conversation went. You know, in our case, it went extraordinarily well. I mean, it's besides the fact that the people were interesting and bright and, and all that stuff. What we discovered is that we were able to go from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the very abstract big picture down to the very practical and back readily and without confusing each other. And so what the conclusion we've reached is that we sort of have operationalized, at least in our own minds, some basic principles. And we brought ourselves back from the brink of errors a couple of times by doing that. So as an example, we went down a path of talking about clarity of expectations to the people and the fact that it's extra work for the workers and are they going to expect some compensation and do we need some incentives? And then we said, wait a minute, basic principles to stay focused on outcomes for clients. If we stay focused on outcomes for clients, we won't get lost in the weeds of incentives and job descriptions and so forth. So we were able to haul ourselves back to the big picture by focusing on outcomes for clients. Similarly, we had a discussion about legislation that we needed to remove barriers from data sharing. And we were going down that road about confidentiality and so forth and remind ourselves, wait, this is supposed to be client-focused. Not all clients are happy about having all their data shared. And so we need rules that take into account client choices, right, that would allow agencies if clients choose. And so I just thought it was worth showing you that we've internalized some of these principles well enough to bring ourselves back from the brink of policy and errors by staying true to a couple of principles. So now my colleague's going to
read the questions.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. All change is disruptive, especially in large and unprecedented initiatives. So the question is, based on the presentations and discussions during the symposium, what are the key considerations that should be addressed by the OCM effort to support and/or accelerate adoption of the interoperability roadmap? And then the second part to that question is, are there any unique workforce development considerations that your organization will face during and/or implementing the roadmap?
So you're going to hear a lot of what you've already heard. So we're going to go over it really briefly and kind of put our spin on it. So the first thing we thought we needed was a vision and direction from the highest level. So this is from the secretary level. We need to know that there's support, that there are some high-level priorities, what needs to be seen, what are the outcomes, and that it provides legislation that assures success for whatever we need to do. So if you need policy changes, there was a reference earlier to some of the AFDC rules or confidentiality we're still dealing with. Well, we need to clear all that out of the way so that we can look at this in a new light. And then we need to establish an agency. So at the highest level, part of the vision and direction is establish the Office of Interoperability, sound familiar, that also provides funding for that, and we talked about A87, 5-year plan to get this up and running and make it a statewide initiative. So that was our first step.
I'm supposed to say a few more practical things about the nature of this agency. We did have some talk about the fact that it might be valuable to have it be time-bound. So it's not just another state agency, but it might exist for 5 years, and that you would recruit differently because of that. We wanted people in that agency who were experts, who'd done change management in projects of this nature elsewhere and knew what works and what doesn't. And also that we would borrow for that 5-year period key opinion leaders from various agencies who would not otherwise readily come to the table. So there might be court people, there might be county people who would be borrowed for that amount of time. But it would be, as this gentleman said over here, their job to lead the change management, to keep people focused on the targets, to identify the quick wins, to keep people focused on outcomes, and so forth.
Okay, and then the third piece of this is communicate the business benefits. So I'm going to have to say up front, I'm from county land, and so for me, the devil is in the details in terms of operationalizing how you truly communicate the benefits. And so with any implementation or a change model, to get people to participate up front or to have long-term sustainable change, particularly when there is scarce resources, the lack of legislative mandates and funding, people have to understand upfront what's in it for them. If they don't, it's going to be difficult for people to participate. And the example that I gave was a basic data sharing situation that we had in our self-sufficiency division. And so we had a mandate many years ago to get information from the school districts regarding if a child attends school. So if a child is not attending school, the self-sufficiency division would sanction them for not attending. So we had the school districts interpret this legislation differently. One school district said, we will provide this information and we would move forward. The other school district said, well, we have confidentiality requirements, this is not a mandate, and we have resource issues. So we were going to stop it because we were penalizing some kids. And so the superintendent called me and he said, Sari, please don't stop this, because the benefit to us is, first of all, we get funding for kids to attend school. There's definitely long-term outcomes, of course, for kids to attend school. And then finally, I have been calling mom for 6 months, and she has not come in until you put that penalty in place. And so one of the issues up front that when we talk about data and data sharing is we have to make sure that this is not so big that people are saying it's just another thing that we're going to do. So part of this office will help with the establishment of priorities, because when we hear about research, and Riverside's a big research group, our systems aren't set up for research. It determines eligibility, and that is our biggest complaint. You know, it's point-in-time data. When you enter data, it erases historical data, and we want information. And so part of this office needs to really look at identifying what the long-term outcomes are that will help identify the benefits. And then from there, we will look at the expectations. So one of the questions is, what are the unique challenges for the workforce? We had a discussion about union, and if you're asking workers to do something different, they need to know the long-term benefits. And so are they going to get a bunch of data that may not help them? Are the parents going to say, is this information going to penalize me? We have to start with, again, outcomes and how people will benefit from this process.
Questions? It's great to be the last speaker before happy hour.
Well, was there any other specific recommendations about a way to implement the OCM effort that would be practical? I mean, these things are all conceptually important, but was there any conversation about stuff to go do immediately?
Well, we have a leader that's volunteered to run this office.
Yeah. I think we mentioned the establishment, getting the backing and funding, right? Those are some very actionable things, right? I guess the kind of thing, this is going to be a big effort. We've heard a couple people say a big effort. It's kind of hard to do grassroots. I mean, some things can be, but if we really want to be effective, we have to have an organization and the agency secretaries kind of buy-in and support that says we're going to do this. that kind of trickles down.
So I thought I heard as I was listening in on your conversation there, stealthily, that there was a recommendation. I just want to throw this out there because I thought it was pretty cool with the CWS new system to take that opportunity, because that's funded or will be funded and it's going to touch everybody across the state, is to build off of that some of the change efforts we're talking about. Because that's going to be implemented, that's going to be driven across the state and the counties, and it's going to touch everybody because child welfare touches everybody. I'm not sure if I'm making that up or if that was something you guys talked about.
Well, and then the stated objective for that project is to demonstrate interoperability already. I mean, that's already part of the objectives for the, right, Sarah? So I think it will be a good demonstration of some very valuable interoperability opportunities with other agencies in other areas, right?
And was OCM part of that conversation?
Well, there's two things. There's a core project that needs to get delivered on time because there's some real significant issues around child welfare right now. So, they have to manage the scope of that. They do plan for some interoperability right out of the initial scope of the project, but there's kind of a phasing, I believe, of some of that's going to come in. So.
Okay.
So I also wanted to say that we're already exercising A87 and cost allocation waiver in California to tunes of a lot of money right now. So we are aware of those opportunities. So we've been trying to work very closely with our counties and with our state partners on the opportunities to utilize that funding. So.
Okay, I think I'm the last speaker before happy hour. We were a group called Synthesis, but if you paid attention, you will note that we worked up here without any of the benefit of what you guys were thinking and doing, so I'm not real sure how that creates synthesis. I think we seem to be working a little bit in a vacuum. Vanna White here will kind of hold that up for me. We had, the question that we considered was, the Interoperability Roadmap Plan identifies significant changes in many areas that you have all talked about and functions across the Health and Human Services Agency in California. To realize the promise of interoperability roadmap, these changes will need to be coordinated and synchronized to have maximum benefit. So we considered 3 questions in this first set in this first question, and then a fourth that I'll read a little bit later. So the first one is, what do you see as the most important actions that can be taken over the next year to support integration across the agencies? And we, what you can't see down here to Lynette's left is the page of ideas that we came up with that, actually the pages, that all contributed to these items. The first item is an executive order that directs vision. Well, we've heard that 2 or 3 times. And so, the idea here is to have this executive order that directs vision and sets a timeline for implementation to make it time-bound, and then define how interoperability will advance in California. The Let's Get Healthy California initiative that Secretary Dooley talked about at lunch is a potential opportunity to galvanize around some of these things. There are 39 measures in that initiative that can be opportunities here to talk about how to set priorities. The second thing was, in addition to the 4 change drivers presented at the symposium, what other change drivers should be addressed to increase the potential for success? Communication and education. Another item that has been mentioned several times, about interoperability, the what, the why, the how, the when, the where, and this notion of stigma reduction around interoperability, and how do you reduce the stigma of sharing your data, or the stigma of people knowing about something that is potentially not necessarily personally identifying, but can carry some ramifications. And then the idea of a scorecard around how are we making progress on this communication and education. And then the third question was, can you identify any unexpected consequences or challenges resulting from the implementation of the interoperability roadmap? And the fourth question, these kind of go hand in hand, are there any new or disruptive ideas that should be considered for inclusion in the interoperability roadmap and or implementation plan? And the idea of stakeholder engagement that includes all parts of the spectrum of stakeholders, including the workforce that some folks in IT were talking about, and across the social worker spectrum. But essentially making sure that we have addressed everybody all up and down the pyramid there, to make sure that we are helping them understand what's in it for them. We heard that over there in OCM, and that we're looking at opportunities that are cross-cutting and meaningful for us all, as the governance team pointed out. And we think that we might have some opportunities here as, folks with hair the color of mine sort of, right off into the sunset, and we have younger folks who are maybe a little bit more predisposed to, sharing things in different ways. Also on the disruptive ideas suggestion, anything, events, that provide incentives to interoperate would be things that we'd be looking to take advantage of. And those kinds of things can be changes in funding models. They can also be changes in service delivery, or maybe the opportunity that we must provide service, say in a natural disaster, where we can maybe put some of these things in place. And that's pretty much what we talked about as synthesis. So I think actually, without having heard what you all were talking about, it actually synthesized them. I don't know how that happened. So I think that's it.